Welcome to Your College Bound Kid,
a podcast for parents, college counselors, students, and anyone who wants a weekly deep dive into the world of college admissions.
My name is Dave. I'm a parent of a daughter in college, and we live in Chicago, Illinois.
I'm Lisa, and I'm a clinical psychologist and college counselor. I have a daughter in college, a daughter in high school, and a son in middle school. After 30 years in Chicago, we recently moved to North Carolina.
My name is Mark. I'm a college coach in Atlanta and the parent of two daughters. Karis, a graduate of Davidson College, and she is the founder of the Spanish tutoring company, SpanishHelpToday.com. And Joy is a graduate of the University of Georgia, and she is getting her master's degree at North Carolina State University.
This week in the news, how this tiny Christian college is driving the right's nationwide war against public schools. Great article by Kathryn Joyce of Salon magazine. Our question from a listener's bonus content from Lisa on what is going on with college mental health centers. Our interview is with Sue Corner, the Dean of Admissions of Willamette University, on myths about private schools, part 1 of 2. And our college spotlight is an interview with the president of Lansing Community College, Steve Robinson, part 1 of 2 on understanding community college.
Friends, thanks for all the well wishes you sent me about my father. Getting all those texts and emails is really, really, really heartening. Service could not have been better. A true celebration of his life. I'm not happy with the airports. What's up with these delays, man? Dave, I hung out in Chicago to 5:30 a.m. because of these planes.
Oh, man, it's terrible.
In the big scheme of things, everything went real well. Yeah. We're invigorated. We're excited and happy to bring you a new episode. So thanks for everybody for all your support. It meant the world to me. Many colleges have an admissions traveling to your area section on their admissions site. Check in August for this and take note of any fairs, school visits, receptions in your area so you can meet with reps who are coming. These are usually the territory managers or the regional reps who will read your student's application file and begin to prepare great questions so that when you meet them, you can get the answers that you're looking for. Okay, admissions vernacular. And now, if you think, boy, how does he know all of these terms? Well, you know what? I learned just like you. This is one I didn't learn until this year. Heard it for the first time. And so I'm not quizzing you, Dave.
No problem. I get it. Go ahead.
So it's TTY. And TTY, what does that stand for? Tough to yield, right? So you've got somebody, you're really excited about them, but we probably have a 1 or 2% chance of getting this kid, and that could come to you for lots of reasons. You could just know that we just don't get kids that are of this type of stature that everybody is going to go after. Or maybe you have some inside intel from somebody that indicated like the kid really loves us at the school. I'm just going to tell you that right now. But TTY, tough to yield. Our big number today is 63. And usually when my big number is a double digit, I'm usually talking percentages. And that would be true this time as well. 63% is the number of students that Johns Hopkins took early decision. So what that means is that the vast majority of applicants, like in some cases over 90%, are trying to squeeze through the small little regular decision door, of which they're only taking 37%.
Yeah.
And so what did that mean? It meant it was the first time ever that Johns Hopkins went under 10% for their acceptance rate. Because when you take massive amounts in ED, locking them in, you have less spots for RD where the masses come, and you have a lower acceptance rate. There are other reasons why schools do that. And the more they hear about kids applying to 17, 18, 19, 20 plus colleges, the more they're like, you know what? Why do I want to play that crapshoot game? Let's go for people that are willing to commit. It's one thing for Davidson College, which oftentimes over 50 and sometimes hit 60, but that's a small 1,900 person Division I school. When you have these small D1 schools like Wofford, Davidson, that, schools do lock their athletes in ED. But Hopkins is a Division III school, so you can't even really say, not to say that Division III doesn't have athletes, because they do, but it's a smaller percentage of the total student body.
It really does change the admissions process from the student's perspective as being almost like a gamble, because you really have to make sure that the ED school you apply to is one that you have a significant chance of getting in. So it's got to be Goldilocks. You can't overshoot, you can't undershoot. If you undershoot, you'll get into a school that you really don't want to go to. But if you overshoot, you miss out on your best opportunity to get into a competitive cohort of schools, because now if you're back into the regular admission crowd, your chances of getting in are, even though your applicant profile has not changed, your chances of getting into that particular school goes down exponentially. So it's a gamble. It's Vegas odds, baby.
And that's why these 75 schools that have ED2 have really seen a surge.
Yeah.
For people for whom money is just completely no issue and they just want to go to a highly selective school and they want increased odds, you're often hearing them being given the advice, have an ED1 and an ED2 ready to go. Now, That's not always true. And that's not, we can't get into a 20, 30-minute conversation here of the nuances of early decision, but you did a good job of articulating the gamble. And sometimes people do go to the other extreme, Dave, where they think, okay, I'm going to take my ED shot at blank school. And if it's a long shot or unlikely, you're still not getting in. I mean, the acceptance rates are oftentimes 3 times higher in the cases of Bates and Colby, between 4 and 5 times higher. But still, it's still not a guarantee. There's still people that are getting denied. And at more selective schools, more are still getting denied than getting admitted. So you're right. You can overshoot or undershoot.
And the problem is it used to be that if you were the top school, if you were the top student, all the scores, valedictorian, whatever, and your counselor advised you to do ED1, your chances of getting in, while not guaranteed, were pretty solid. But now, even for the strongest students, going to those top 10, 20, 30 schools now is a total crapshoot, even on ED1 and ED2. So it's just a lot of stress for the kids.
Yeah, and that's why, what the single best thing people can do is to not have a mindset that there's 30 great schools out there. That's the single best thing.
Absolutely.
The single best thing is to expand the playing field.
Yeah.
That's the single best thing. And I will always challenge people to that. Now, you always find that ambitious kids are ambitious. People that do really well aspire and have high goals. Nothing's wrong with that, as long as you've got a solid plan C and D in place. All right, Dave. So, it's every 5th week, and that means it's rant and rave time. It means it's grinding my gears time, thanks to my daughter, who, by the way, now lives in Charlotte again.
Just dropped her off yesterday.
No dropping off. She got certified to drive these big vans. That would scare me. She's on the freeway. I would never do that. But she got the U-Haul herself. that thing that says $29.95, but it's really not $20 or $19.95 on the sign, but it's really like, whatever, $300 or $400 when you're doing a move like that. But she did all that. She said, hey, guy friends, come move me, So all her guy friends loaded her up, and she drove with Anitra, my wife, who's going to spend the first week with her and get her settled in her lovely place. But that's all good, because guess what, Dave? At 5 a.m. tomorrow, I head to Colorado for a week.
Wow.
So I will be able to come back and have a great report. I'll be spending 12 hours on the campus of the University of Denver. On Tuesday, 12 hours on the campus of the University of Colorado Boulder on Wednesday, and 12 hours on the campus of Colorado College on Thursday. And that's when this goes live. So when this goes live, should be hanging out on Colorado College. We've done spotlights on all of them already, but I'm going to try to just supplement them by sharing some things I didn't share in those spotlights. I'll go back and listen to the spotlights and highlight some things that I didn't share from those spotlights, because I'm going to be fresh on the campus for 12 hours meeting with all their leaders. Why not do it? So I'm excited about this, and it's all free, which is one of the nice perks of this job, when they fly you in to get to know the colleges more. Not a bad opportunity. I feel blessed. All right, Dave, grinding the gears time. So I had 2 conversations this week, and I found them a little unsettling. I was talking with the family, and they had mentioned that they had considered using this company to help them with the college process. And I felt a sort of comfort level with them. They're being very kind and transparent. And so I just said, can I ask you what they charged? And they said, oh, yeah, they have 2 packages. One's $15,000 and one is $30,000.
Wow.
And then I had another conversation with somebody else later in the week, a friend. And he said, I want you to take a look at this website. I really think they did a great job with their website. But there's one thing I need to let you know. They charge $25,000. And my question is, why? Why does somebody have to gouge people like that? If you listen to Femi Agdalini, who's the dean of admission at Berkeley, he goes off on the IEC profession because he said you're preying on people's fears.
Yes.
And why people still need to pay whatever amount. Let's call it 1 to 10,000 for test prep. Most people will do. Most people will pay 1 to 10,000 for hotel, airfare, rent a car, meals. I know that we spent almost 6,000 for Karis 10 years ago. So I know just traveling, especially if you take 4 people now, 4 airline tickets, throw in meals and hotels, you do a couple trips like that, you're already well up to 5,000-10,000 easily. And then people are going to pay for app fees. And then some people are in private school, and then they're staring at a tuition. Like, why does somebody have to charge that amount of money? Like, to me, you reveal that you're in it for yourself and you're not in it to help people. And the people that need your help the most cannot afford anything even close to that. And so it just grinds my gears because it gives the profession a bad reputation. It's not necessary to do it. Can make a good living not charging anybody even a fraction of that. Now, I recognize that some places have higher cost of living than others. I recognize you can't, the devil's in the details. Like some people may include all 4 years, and some people may be looking at 1 year, and some people might throw in tutoring and test. I realize that. So I don't want to stand in judgment. But my question is, why? Why do you need to gouge people like that? It just pisses me off, and it gives the profession a bad name. Sorry, Dave. This one really did grind my gears.
No, I think it's legitimate, and I think once again, it fuels the cynicism behind education.
I mean, some people will say, well, we say if you can't afford a price list, reach out, you may be available for a discount. But you know what? Not everybody likes to do that. Not everybody, like, that can work against your sense of self that, I like to think I'm a successful person, this, that, the other. I don't want to feel like I'm getting a welfare. Like, not everybody's comfortable with that. And you're going to miss out people that you want to help. And that's what I hear when I speak on this topic. Well, you can always ask for a discount. I mean, I don't know. I just have a big, big problem with, and you know what? I hate to say it because I really disagree with Femi when he says that, because I know how many people are so into it for the right reason to just help kids. But I can't help but believe he's right when he says that. Why are you preying off people's fears and exploiting them? Like,
yeah.
And just because the market allows it, just because some people will do anything for their kids, anything, so they'll make that type of sacrifice, it's just wrong.
Yeah.
I think we agree.
I would completely agree. It's exploitive and it's dangerous for a variety of reasons.
All right. So what am I happy about? I had to come down over here. Sorry. I'm seeing an increase of schools going back to interviews. Now, one of the reasons why they're doing it, I know, and it's a good reason, is they're trying to figure out who's serious and who's not serious. That's one reason. Or they're trying to drum up interest in kids, because the more competitive it is, the more, if you can be high touch, you have a better chance of being the school to land the kid. You're the one who showed them the personal touch. But first of all, that's a good reason to do it, in my opinion, in of itself. But what I also like is it's allowing more students an opportunity to be really more fully evaluated, not just what's on paper, but anything that is conducive to a greater understanding of who a person is. So more factors can be factored in, and making holistic admissions more comprehensive, I'm an advocate for. So look, it's not going to happen across the board. It requires incredible amounts of resources to do this. So don't expect most schools to do it. But I'm definitely seeing the reinstatement of the interview at a different level. Sometimes during the pandemic, you kind of had to do it because you couldn't visit. You couldn't visit them. They couldn't visit you. So you saw a lot of these Zoom interviews popping up. I think it's fantastic, and I'm going to shout it out.
Okay.
All right, Dave. We got a controversial article, but an important one. Take it away, my friend.
And now it's time for Hot Topics in the News.
It is how this tiny Christian college is driving the right's nationwide war against public schools, and it's by Kathryn Joyce in Salon. And basically, it starts off talking about a father in Orange County who has become very influential in starting a charter school. And the school under discussion that night wasn't a regular public school. It was recently launched charter called the Orange County Classical Academy, which is funded with taxpayer money but follows a private school like curriculum centered on, quote, the history and cultural achievements of Western civilizations and an ambiguous mission to install virtue. The face of this charter school is the co founder, Dr. Jeff Barkey, a Newport Beach concierge physician who gained national notoriety as one of the most outspoken skeptics of pandemic public health policies and has voiced vitriolic opposition to today's public schools. And it goes on to say that OCC isn't only a school or even a network of schools. It's just one facet of a national movement driven by the vision and curriculum of Hillsdale College, a small Christian school in southern Michigan that has quietly become one of the most influential entities in conservative politics. The article says that in an era of book bans, crusades against teaching about racism, and ever widening proposals to punish teachers and librarians, Hillsdale is not just a central player, but a ready made solution for conservatives who seek to reclaim an educational system they believe was ceded decades ago to liberal interests. The college has become a leading force in promoting a conservative and overtly Christian reading of American history and the U.S. Constitution. It opposes progressive education reforms in general and contemporary scholarships on inequality in particular. And it has features lectures describing the January 6th insurrection as a hoax and Vladimir Putin as a quote hero to populist conservatives around the world. And I'm not going to go through a lot of this article because it's quite lengthy, and I know you're going to have a lot to say about it. But I'm going to just basically talk a little bit about Hillsdale College. What is Hillsdale College? Well, it's a private, very small liberal arts college in Michigan that, even though it has 1,500 students, actually has an endowment of over 900 million, as it has become the darling of conservatives throughout the last several decades. It has featured, it says, quote, for decades, 1,500 student Hillsdale College, a liberal arts school in rural southern Michigan, founded by Baptist abolitionists in 1844, has become known as, quote, a citadel of conservatism. Its campus features prominent statues of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. Its curriculum leans heavily into the Western canon of great books, and it describes itself as a trustee of modern man's intellectual and spiritual inheritance from the Judeo Christian faith and Greco Roman culture. In the 1980s, the college earned right wing adulation for refusing to accept any federal funding, including student aid, to maintain its independence in every regard. In practice, this means it doesn't have to comply with federal regulations, such as Title IX prohibitions on sex discrimination or the reporting of student racial demographics. And it goes on to say, in recent years, Hillsdale has greatly expanded its influence, becoming one of the most significant actors in U.S. conservative politics. It is also one of the least conspicuous. Throughout the Trump years, there was a virtual revolving door that shuffled Hillsdale staff and alumni back and forth between the school, the White House, and Capitol Hill. Right-wing politicians and thought leaders vie to give speeches at Hillsdale, which are then disseminated to an acclaimed audience of 6.2 million through the school's monthly publication Imprimis. In 2019, Hillsdale hired right-wing activist Jeannine Thomas, the wife of Justice Thomas, to help the college launch a Washington campus on Capitol Hill across the street from the Heritage Foundation. And bottom line is that Hillsdale has a planned expansion to have 50 schools, over 50 schools and more, that are charter schools that preach its version of intellectual history and to expand its conservative influence into the primary and secondary school system. So a very complex and long article, Mark. Why don't I stop here and see where you want to take it?
Sure. And I know we're going to get some emails. We always do. Why are you guys talking about politics in this article? And we're not trying to be 538. We're not trying to be the Daily. We're not trying to be the Bulwark. We're not trying to be any of these other podcasts out here talking about politics. But politics also is values. Okay. Are we supposed to sit here and not even mention the fact that this country came close to having a massacre in our state capital? Like, that's real world, real life. And so sometimes you can't help but talk about it. And this is a significant movement on a lot of levels. So basically what's going on is that charter schools were intended to be a way of using public funds to create a hybrid model, with some of the best things of public schools and some of the best things of private, but to target under-resourced neighborhoods and give them a chance at having quality education. That's what the KIP network is. I've been a part of for 14 years as an employee, and 21 years counting, my work I did on the recruitment side before I moved to Atlanta. But what's happening, and it's just a trend that people need to be aware of to know what's going on, is it's pretty significant, is the same thing that Fox News is doing. And the fact that Fox News hasn't even shown the 1-6 hearings exposes it for not being news at all, but being propaganda. That mindset is now attempted to be exported nationwide. In other words, let's get to people younger and try to brainwash them with certain things about America and not talk about other things. And the interesting thing is they're using taxpayer dollars to do it. So they formed a partnership, and what really gets unique is they formed a partnership with Tennessee, this Hillsdale College, to build out these 50 schools using public funds, $32 million set aside to build a network. And it's not just Tennessee. They have plans to do this in 13 states. And they have plans to go beyond that. They've developed their own 1776 curriculum, which portrays America as an exceptionally good country. It glosses over, it's very critical of things like the New Deal, the Great Society, global warming, civil rights movement, and that's what they're attempting to do. And when I say Fox News, it's the same thing. I have a friend of mine who is MAGA, and I mentioned him before on here. He's all MAGA, he's all Trump, and I'm not that at all. I'm not going to pretend to you what my views and values are on something as important as that. But I've tried my best to not lose our friendship over this, and I've tried my best to understand how he can think. And I've realized it's because of the news that he's getting. He's getting a steady dose of Fox News. So he misses certain things. And that's not to say there's not bias on the left either, because there's bias in all things have bias. Bias in British news, there's bias in other sources of news. But the Fox News mindset is we will not even expose people, unless it's normally in a caricature form, to another version of reality in attempt to control people's minds. And the exporting of that, it started out with, railing against critical race theory, which then became, we can't have Toni Morrison, which then became, we don't even want to hear the Martin Luther King I Have a Dream speech anymore. That's where that went. And that mindset is creeping into public schools at a young age. And that's why this becomes an important story. And if you look at, and Dave and I looked at two articles. One is in the New York Times by Stephanie Saul, called "A College Fights Leftist Academics by Expanding Its Charter School Network," and then the other one's by Salon. But they have plans to expand beyond this. They have plans to roll out a master's program to indoctrinate teachers with this perspective. And it just speaks to how divided the country is right now. It also speaks to, as an individual, you have to not just look at knowledge and take it face value that it's truth. You have to consider the source and consider the presuppositions and biases through which that knowledge occurs. Now, the interesting thing about the New York Times article is that it focuses on Atlanta Classical. Now, I know Atlanta Classical really well. It's a new charter school here in Atlanta. And in fact, one of the top employees I ever worked with we lost him like a week after he took the job. But I spent a lot of time with him in that week. We'd gone out, we'd had several meals together, and I thought, this guy's gonna be great. Well, they just threw a bunch of money at him, and several students I work with on my CBO side are at Atlanta Classical, and I see how subtle their message is, because they're going to preach their college acceptances, they're going to preach their small classes, they're going to preach their high SAT scores. A lot of people go for this because of high SAT scores, small classes, personal attention, and look at our college list. But they don't realize that there's a brainwashing that's occurring. And so this is just, I like to identify trends. When we did our survey, the thing that scored the highest, that we asked you, what do you want to see? And we gave you a list of all these things to pick. The thing that scored the absolute highest was admission trends. It even scored higher than admissions tips, is tell us the trends. And so one of the things we try to do on here is detect trends. And this is a trend, and I realize if you've got Fox News politics, you're probably throwing something at your phone and cussing me out right now. But I'm not going to hide my views. Politics also oftentimes speak to values. And this is a values-based movement that I personally do not think is good for the country. But it's a trend that I think people should be aware of. Thoughts, Dave?
Well, I guess I'm not so fearful of it as you. I do believe that alternative perspectives should be heard, because the reality is unfortunately, there's different perspectives. The analogy I want to give is, we're on a trip. Let's say we're on the first slave ship. And if you're on the first class and you take the ocean voyage and you're on the first deck, was a wonderful trip. But if you were on the lower decks, or if you were enslaved, it was not a good trip. There are two truths there, that the journey from America to where we started and where we are today has been a very tough and arduous one for many, many people, ones filled with discrimination and racism and so forth. And for another group of people, it's been a wonderful trip. It's been one of conquest and one of prosperity and so forth. So, and of course, both sides want to promote their vision of the truth and perspective. And so I think it's important that there's a fair hearing on both perspectives. If people want to go out and have schools that cater to one exclusive perspective, that is their right. Just as it is our right to promote an alternative view of education. And hopefully when people get to college, they'll be open-minded enough to see a variety of perspectives and to be able to discern their level of truth from that. It's a complicated way of saying, if Hillsdale wants to go out and get 50, 60, 80 charter schools and preach X, Y, and Z, and if they have a market for that, more power to them. I think that we just have to focus on basically promoting what we see as the appropriate perspective. And, it's a market of ideas out there, and you have to fight for your level of truth.
Yeah, I think I might have disagreed with you more than I've ever on this podcast.
Yeah.
You can't both sides something like this. There's truth and there's not truth. You're going to make stuff. They're teaching history in an ahistorical matter. It's not. I admit that history is subjective, and I know that the winner goes the spoils, and they write the books. But there's things they're saying that are just not accurate, and they're brainwashed. I mean, I don't think you would agree. Well, Tucker Carlson, that's his version of truth, and if that's what he believes, everybody has a right to believe what they believe, and that's his opinion. This, that, the other. I think you don't have that view of him. They're Tucker Carlsoning the brainwashing of 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, 12-year-olds with Tucker Carlson's ideology. And that is not a good thing. And they are doing it with public tax dollars. And that point cannot be emphasized enough. Hillsdale's a private college, so they have the right to teach what they want. But you said it yourself. They are teaching that January 6th attack on the Capitol was a hoax with public tax dollars. And if you disagree with that, then we have a big disagreement.
No, but life is a battle of ideas.
I agree with that. I'm just talking about whether it's a good thing or a bad thing for society to teach history in an ahistorical manner is not a good thing. I agree it's a battle of ideas, but I just don't believe that. Well, Tucker Carlson, he has a right to have his version. You have a right, and blah blah blah. Like, impressionable young minds' worldview will be shaped if you're sitting as a 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 12, 18-year-old and exposed to that mindset, that perspective is very dangerous.
Okay, so everybody's going to have a perspective on history. There is no one truth. People are going to view it as, and you have to fight for your ideals, and you have to fight for your values, and you have to fight in terms of intellectual argument, thesis. You have to fight in terms of persuasion. And this is the one thing that I will give conservatives their props for. In the last 30 years, they have built educational institutions and promoted a thought that I do not agree with, but they've used that as a foundation for promoting arguments that they have then been able to translate successfully into policy. Instead of the alternative view railing against, hey, they have an alternative perspective, we don't agree with that, look what they're doing. I think that we need to go back to our arguments and make them even more persuasive and argue those points in the public forum to win adherents and followers. And through the art of intellectual persuasion, get people to then change their policy viewpoints. But it's a battle that's waged in the intellectual arena, one in the mind, not one in the streets with guns and so forth. So I don't fear alternative modes of thought. I don't fear the fact that they're starting schools that may disagree with my point of view. Go ahead and do that. I think what we need to do is be secure in our point of view and be ready to argue our points in a civil manner, both intellectually and politically, and let the people decide based on the strength and persuasion of each argument.
Do you feel the same way with Putin? The way Putin doesn't allow Russians to be exposed to anything other than his ideology? Do you think go ahead and do that? More power to you? Because that sounds what it's.
That's a false analogy because what Putin doesn't allow any discourse. I mean, the reality is there's no discussion whatsoever. It's like that's like having one like Fox News and nothing else. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying is that if there are two charter schools and one wants to be based on the 1619 theory of the United States and the other wants to be based on the 1776 theory of the United States, two radically different theories, parents can choose which school they want to have their child taught under or indoctrinated under or so forth. That's their choice. We can try and persuade our arguments, but you're going to turn out some kids are going to be liberally biased, others are going to be conservative biased, and that's okay. When they get to the arena of college or life, they will hopefully use their intellect and through civil discourse to try and persuade each other of each other's point of view or come to a compromise through which we can go through policy. But the important thing is I prefer that the battles be waged on the intellectual forums than one in the streets and waged with the pen and not with the gun.
Yeah, but you're talking mostly about strategy. What is the most, this is not a strategy conversation. This is a conversation about what is actually happening to the minds of people. And I think, Dave, you're being naive to say, hopefully they'll be able when they get to college. Like I see a couple cousins on my wife's side that are involved in this kind of movement. I see how just completely brainwashed they are. And to think that that would be instilled in a kid from 4 to 18 and then they go to college and they're going to have a different perspective, that is going to happen very rarely. So I just see it as a lot. The bottom line is I see teaching American history in an inaccurate way to impressionable minds for 15 years is something that is very dangerous. And without getting into what should be your best strategy to counteract that, I just think that needs to be stated as a fact. To teach history in an inaccurate way to impressionable minds, and then this is where it really touches education. To tap into tax dollars to do this, it's a trend, and it's the Fox Newsification of the population is what it is, exporting that. And I think that that's dangerous, but I don't want to belabor this too long. I want to keep this one short. How does this relate to college admissions? Well, it relates to education. It relates to how minds are shaped and forces that are happening in this country to keep certain things from being introduced because of the fear of how people will think if they're exposed to those ideas. And so rather than wanting to stand in debate, now listen, can that happen on the other side? Yeah, that can as well. There can be such homogenous thinking on the left that you're not even exposed to how large swaths of people think. And I mean, I frequently share this. I had a conversation with a family from New Jersey about this recently, and the family leans very progressive in the politics, and they were looking at schools that are very progressive. And they asked me a very profound question. They said, what is the biggest weakness of this school? You've said a lot of great things. What is the biggest weakness? And I had to say, well, the biggest weakness is that you almost will not hear very many voices from the right. So you'll get a caricature of those views rather than being able to hear their strongest arguments. And I think hearing the strongest arguments from people who are adherents to the views actually develops your intellectual thinking better than just having everybody stifled because they know that they're going to be looked at disdainfully if they speak up because their views are so dissimilar to what's politically acceptable in the culture. And so you silence dissenting views, you get caricatures of the other side, you don't get their best arguments. I decry that as well. I do think it's important that when you're having intellectual discourse, you're able to hear the strongest views from both sides from people that adhere to them. One reason why Karis picked Davidson is that it leans left politically, but at least there's enough of a presence from the right that you can hear their strongest arguments, which better develops your critical thinking skills. So I'm not... Yeah, I do want to be fair, and I do believe that is the best way to grow, is to be exposed to different ideas and different perspectives.
And to that point, see, no one side has a monopoly on the truth, neither the left nor the right, the Democrats or Republicans. The reality is, I believe that the truth is nuanced, and the best path is usually somewhere in the middle. And so I say all power to the hard right if they want to develop their own school of thought. All power to the hard left if they want to develop their own school of thought. What I hope happens is that at some point there's a meeting of the minds, that there's intellectual clash in the middle. And through that, it's a messy process, but through argument or persuasion, people can hear both points of view and come to their determination in their own mind of what is the truth. But to that point, I don't fear Hillsdale College. It's tiny. Yeah, it gets a lot of hype and support, but Hillsdale versus Harvard is no match.
Well, I'm not talking about fear. I'm talking about identifying a trend that's happening that is the new trend that, states giving their money to export a different version of American history. Let me ask you this, Dave, just to test your theory. Yeah. So if you go listen to a number of people, certainly the KKK and all of those groups, but not even groups that don't have that type of moniker or that type of stigma behind them, they will say that the Civil War had nothing to do with slavery. They'll say that.
And there is a strong argument that has been made previously to that point. I don't agree with it, but the fact is people have the right to hold it. People have the right to research it. People have the right to promulgate it. What you have to do is come back with your own facts and your own perspective and argue the counterpoint.
But let me ask you this. This is public tax dollars. Certainly a private school can set up and it can teach whatever it wants, and people can pay money to get that perspective. So are you saying that you would have no problem with a public school taking public tax dollars to teach the fact that the Civil War had nothing to do with slavery or racism? Are you saying you have no issue with that?
There's no one sanctioned legitimate perspective on history. People's perspective on history, it varies and changes based on their own perspective, their own social standing, their own race, creed, tribe, so forth. So the problem is that while I may disagree with multiple people's versions of history, I can't take my version and say that's the one that's sanctioned, then that's the only one that should be taught. The fact is that there's no consensus. And so if there are two schools, if there's two groups of people there's liberals and conservatives. And liberals want to have their version of history taught in their school, and conservatives want their version of history taught in their school. And they both have equal access to dollars to create their own charter schools. And on one is the liberal version of history, and the other is the right version of history, then parents have a right to choose where they want to send their kids. And those two heads of schools then have to go out in the public forum and argue to the public why they feel their version and their school and education is appropriate. And that's how I think it should be. So if Hillsdale College wants to create 50 schools, say, this is what we believe, and there's a whole bunch of people rah, 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 and saying, hey, we want to go to Hillsdale, and they flourish and so forth, more power to them. I personally believe that there's a whole lot more people in this multi-ethnic, increasingly diverse, multinational, younger, increasingly skewing liberal population that wants a more nuanced and more balanced view of history. And so if I had to start charter schools, I'd much rather be in the economic position of catering to that crowd, because one is a smaller minority, diminishing crowd, and the other caters to the population of the future. So that's why I don't fear Hillsdale. I don't fear what they're doing. If they want to do their own 1776 gig and try and sell it to the public, more power to them. I believe the truth and the power of my perspective will win out in the end. And I have no problems challenging their perspective in the arena of public thought.
Yeah, the one thing you said I disagree with vehemently is, you sort of act like, it sounds like you're saying, because no two people will ever agree on something, you can have your truth, I can have my truth, and there's no objectivity to truth. So if we take something really contemporary, what happened at the Capitol on January 6th? There's facts there. And you can't, and somebody to me just can't come in and say it was what was the term? It was not a picnic. It was some people were saying, oh, I wish I could quote it right. It was just a typical visit by a bunch of visitors. That's not true. That's not true. And so to say, well, that's some people's perspective. You have your view, I have my view. There are things that are right and wrong and are objective and not objective, and you'll never reach consensus on everything. And if the standard is, as long as two people have different views, then, hey, you have your truth, I have my truth, then there's no such thing as any absolute truth.
There is not. In our political side, there isn't an absolute truth. We are tribal. And the bottom line is there's a percentage of people, they're a minority, but they believe that everything that happened in January 6th had nothing to do with the current leadership, and that Donald Trump was not held liable. And then there's the other side, the majority, who don't have that point of view. But I can't deny the minority from their point of view. That's their view. They can express it.
I just want to see how far you go with this. So let's say someone says Martin Luther King was never a real person. He wasn't. He didn't come here. Is your view? Well, that's your truth.
No, I don't want to get into tangents of hypotheticals.
No, but I'm trying to see if your view is.
My view is this. I believe that most people are sensible, and moderate, and persuadable to a degree. I believe that we're a society that is now dominated by the extremes, and both extremes are drowning out the sensible middle. And I believe that if you give the sensible middle the opportunity to intellectually breathe, to actually see the points of view presented by both extremes in a non-threatening, intellectually open manner, that they will choose the views that most often hew to common sense and to the facts, more often than not. So I believe that the biggest thing right now is we have to present a forum where the moderate, sensible middle can breathe and not have their views drowned out by either extremes. That's what I believe.
All right. Well, I'm going to stop it here because I think we've deviated more of college admissions than we normally do, and people log in for this for college admissions. I happen to think any trends that greatly affect education also end up impacting college admissions. I mean, you can see it right now. Some of the things being proposed by the governor in Florida. And so these things start with an idea and they grow into different and go in different directions. So to me, all of this is interrelated. But I think we've talked this up enough. This is why now our listeners know why a couple years ago I said, hey, man, we should have a new podcast, Stucker and Tucker. Now they get it, man.
It's not Tucker.
And they see now they know who Tucker is because it ain't me.
No, I look, I am just beyond hyperventilating over every single time. Oh my God, they're doing this.
Yeah,
but
I wasn't calling for hyperventilating. The purpose of this is not to get anybody to hyperventilate. It's the students that I know that are Atlantic Classical, and I know several. I worked at 3 this year. They don't think that this is what they're buying into. It's just very subtle. They think they're picking a school that has small classes, that has high SAT scores, that has a good college list, and they're basically getting almost a version of a private school for public pricing. And so I still would be critical, but I would be less critical if it was a truth in advertising of they exactly were clear about what they were espousing and people chose to buy into it. I'd be critical still, but less critical. But it's the subtlety of what's happening that I think is a concern. But we've talked that enough. And, I think it is good for people to hear different views talked about. And, some people will agree with you. Some people will agree with me. That's what hopefully makes for a good learning laboratory. We try to bring new trends, growing trends, anything in education to the forefront so that people are aware of them. And to me, this is a pretty significant trend. I do want to close with one quote, from the article. I've been following charter schools for the last 25 years. I've never seen a governor attempt to use charters in such an overtly political way, said Bruce Fuller, professor of education and public policy at the University of California, Berkeley. You've had governors who've encouraged the growth of charters to provide more quality options for parents, but it's highly unusual to see a governor deploy the charter mechanism for admittedly political purposes. And so, that's my final thought. And look, we're not going to talk about this kind of thing very often. This is the kind of thing we might do a 1 out of 100 episodes. Normally we'll stay a little closer to our lane of college admissions. But when it impacts education in a significant way, we also want to pride ourselves of not being afraid to talk about any of the hot topics just because they're controversial. We've talked about affirmative action before, and when the Supreme Court comes down with the decision, we'll talk about it again. I think we don't do a disservice if we're ducking and hiding things just because they're controversial. I think we owe you more than that. And we also owe you our perspective. Yeah. You've got a lens into my conservative Clarence Thomas friend over here, man. We're a little different.
That's not true. It's not even. I represent the silent middle.
Okay. All right, my friend. Well, I'll see you when I get back from Colorado.
Okay, my friend.
And now it's time for a question from one of our listeners.
All right, Lisa, bonus content time. You're up.
Bonus content. Great.
So, but before we get into that, I'm going to do my little what would surprise you if you're in admissions. I think one thing that might surprise people, especially this pertains more to more selective schools. I think sometimes there's the perception out there, not that people revel in denying, but let me put it this way. I don't think people realize how much admission officers really read. They really do read to admit. Like, they want to admit kids. Like, it gets frustrating if you're reading a file and let's say there's a grade slippage and there's no explanation of what happened, or there's a big period where you missed a lot of school, or you dropped out of your extracurriculars. Like, they're like, I wish this kid would explain what happened because maybe there's a plausible reason and we could cut them some slack. Now, sometimes if schools are more staffed, they'll reach out to the student or reach out to the counselor. But they really do want to admit. They're like cheerleaders pulling for kids, hoping that they can admit. And it hurts denying, So I don't know. I just think that might surprise some people. So that's my little tip for the day.
Yeah, it's not, they're not heartless bastards. Right?
Yes, you just broke it down.
They care, but that's their job.
I could have said everything in 5 seconds by saying they're not heartless bastards.
I'm sure there's one or two heartless bastards,
I
but
took
there's
the circuitous route, and you just went right in for it. Reminds me of like 5 weeks or so ago when you said, when I gave that tip on recommendations, and you said, I never thought about the narcissist. The narcissist teacher. You just broke it down.
Oh,
All right.
man.
Well, I'm excited today because I look forward to your bonus content. I know our listeners do. I know you're always combining some combination of psychology and college counseling, or psychology or mental health, and excelling in school. And I know there's 2 articles that you want to touch on today, and both of them are kind of fascinating. And so I know one leads with the headline, "It's time to demand timely mental health reporting by colleges and universities." And this is by 2 doctors, Dr. Kathryn Sarkeesian and Dr. Marian Mass. And, it gets into comparing mental health to COVID, but I'll let you talk about that. And then there's a second article that I know you also want to touch on. And this is a Gallup blog. And these are recent articles. Like this one is April 27th, 2022. And the title of this is "A third of U.S. college students consider withdrawing from college." So those are the 2 different articles I know you want to talk about. So take it away, Lisa.
Right. Well, I think, I've run across both of these articles relatively recently, and they sort of just pointed out a topic that I thought we should talk about on the podcast, which is, what is going on with treatment for mental health issues as they become more prevalent at college mental health centers. What are some of the problems? What are some potential solutions? And then how can parents evaluate what's going on at college mental health centers, and how can they set up treatment for their kids? When they're going to college, because I think as we can sort of see, if a third of U.S. students consider withdrawing, and the most common reason is for mental illness issues. And then also, in the article, "It's time to demand timely mental health reporting by colleges and universities." The authors argue that instead of just reporting COVID cases and quarantines and illnesses, that colleges should also report the number of suicides that they're experiencing every year. And the fact that is actually a larger cause of death for college students than COVID. And they suggest that, parents and kids should have access to that information rather than trying to scrounge it up. For instance, they give some examples. So at Worcester Polytechnic Institute, there were 5 suicides in 1 year. At Stanford, there were 4 in 13 months. And, even if people are not suicidal, we know that at least 1 in 3 college students are depressed, and maybe, about 50% are experiencing some symptoms of depression and anxiety. So they're suggesting that, don't just use the government money for quarantine, COVID testing, reporting, put money into the counseling services that your schools provide. So I think that what I took from these articles is that, even if your kid is going to school, without any mental illness issues, it's not unlikely that they could develop some when they're at college. And what is available to those kids, and, what kind of experiences are they likely to have at those college counseling centers? So, and I think that even before COVID, college counseling centers were struggling. And I think it has, unfortunately, the demand has increased, the staff has decreased, and that's never a good situation. So I just wanted to kind of talk about that so that parents and students could be educated consumers for when they are, looking at schools. So this should be another variable that you consider.
Yeah, one of the things that I liked about the article, to me, there were some real actionable items. I mean, the statistics it presented on suicides, attempted suicides, depression, and withdrawals, it was very, very, very compelling. But it was really basically almost a call to action to use a term I've used recently in the podcast, to be squeaky as a parent, and to be asking what the resources are, asking how much, detailed questions about what resources are there. And I know this from working in schools, that enough people start asking things, that's how change gets made.
Right.
If people feel like, whoa, we're getting asked some really tough questions about this, particularly if you start not yielding students over this, and then that shows up in your surveys and you report that back, we're getting killed because, our mental health support services are not the same as our competitors. That's how change occurs. That's one of the reasons why these schools make all the changes with their dorms and their meal plans. and everything from living learning communities to athletics, because they start to see like we're losing to our competitors.
Right.
And then the other thing that it also did was it challenged US news. Why is there not a component of this at all in their rankings? Is if when you see that we're at a crisis, why is there nothing at all about like the resources that are dedicated, factored all into your formulas? But go ahead, you want to say something, Lisa? Mm-hmm.
Oh, I was just saying, I think that, it is a variable that I think people haven't been thinking about, but probably they should. Whenever you go on a campus tour, they're always like, oh, here's the student mental health center, and there are all these therapists and they can help you. And there's a crisis line and it's 24/7. Like, it's all one big fuzzy blanket we're going to wrap you up in. So no worries, right? And that's always the impression that they give. But I think the actual experience of students at many institutions is very different.
Yeah, and I think there's some simple, straightforward questions you can ask. One of the questions, is how many full-time people work in that department. And once again, when you do that, you need to divide it by the number of students to get a sense. And those are questions you can ask. You can also ask about what's their process. Walk me through your process.
Mm-hmm.
And now you can also try to find out to what extent do they proactively try to find out if somebody's struggling versus waiting for some exigency.
Yes.
But to me, this was a call to the public demanding change. Yeah.
I really do think that. And I'll give you some more information about things that have happened at different schools and some thoughts about, what is the state of affairs right now and what sorts of things can colleges do to improve the situation, because it's not working at this point, I think, for most institutions.
Yeah. And that's why I always like to have it's kind of like the so what in your writing, right? Like, okay, so we've heard it's bad. Are we just helpless?
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything that can be done to affect change?
Right. Absolutely. So, but the first step of that is knowledge, right?
Sure.
So I found a great article in the Northwestern student newspaper, and this dates back to before COVID, but there was a student who had a really negative experience with the student health center, and they hospitalized him because they said he had an eating disorder when he kept telling me he had a medical condition, which eventually was borne out. They kept trying to treat him for an eating disorder. And then, he couldn't get in. There are all these students who are on the wait list for months and months, or that people don't call them back. And there's now a group at Northwestern of students who are advocating for change with the Student Mental Health Center. And, it's interesting because they interviewed the president of Northwestern, Morton Shapiro, and he said, I don't understand this, because every single time the counseling department comes and asks me more money, I say how much, and I write them a check. So how can this be happening? And yet it still is. And I think, so that I think counseling centers in general, what you're going to see is there's increased demand, right? Number one, as we've talked about before, there's more stress just in the air, in the news, in life. People are, maybe came into college already having some negative emotional impacts from high school and, the things that they went through there. So, and kids are more comfortable talking about mental illness issues. So rightfully so, they're asking for treatment. So you've got increased demands. But I think in addition to that, you also have more severe symptoms. So most college counseling centers are set up on what we call a capitated model. So they evaluate you and they give you 6 to 8 sessions. And either you're done and you're cured in 6 to 8 sessions, or they try to refer you out into the community. Well, if there's just somebody broke up with their boyfriend and they're a little sad, or maybe they got a B+ on the test and they need to work on some, resilience skills, maybe you could do that in 6 to 8 sessions and out they go. But if you have people who are seriously depressed, anxious, suicidal, that is not a 6 to 8 session case, right?
Yeah.
It can't be. So I think that, we see an increase in suicidal ideation. So we're saying 25%, I think, of college students are thinking somewhat seriously about hurting or killing themselves at any given moment. And so that whole system of treatment, it can't fit that, in addition, even though we know there's all these stresses on students, they have higher levels of mental illness. There's a social worker at UNC Chapel Hill, Tara Bowley, and she said something in an article that I really loved, which is one of the biggest failures of higher education is that it teaches students that their GPA that is more important than their well-being, that high levels of stress are normal, and the poor mental health is just the price you have to pay for academic success. And so I do recognize that a lot in many college campuses, you're there to study, right? You're there to get the grades, you're there to do the thing, and they're not looking at the whole picture. I'm not saying that we should, just stop giving students, any tests or ask them to write papers or ask them to learn things, but when we are doing it in the same way, but yet the mental health situation has changed, the cultural situation has changed. Is that fair? So, it's just a big problem. And to me, it's really interesting to think how are student health centers, how are student mental health clinics, when did they start getting into the business of treating kids? That's sort of the expectation, but they've never had the funding to do it. They've had waiting lists for years. And they've always had these capitated things. But I think the thing that was on their side before was that they could refer out to the community. But see, now it's a double whammy. They can't refer out to the community because all of us in private practice and all the hospitals and all the clinics, there's no room.
Well, I was going to talk to you about this off air, Lisa, but it makes sense to integrate this into the conversation. So our regular listeners know that my daughter Joy is at North Carolina State University getting a master's in clinical mental health counseling. And if you would have talked to her 1 month ago, 2 months ago, 3 months ago, she wanted to go work on a college campus when she graduated. She's like, I like working with that age kid, blah, blah, blah. So now she's 1 year away from, it's a 2-year program. She goes all the way through 2 summers. So she's completely through the first year. And she's friends with the second years. She knows a lot of them. Several live in her complex and everything. And she was like, every one of them passed their licensure and they all have jobs lined up. And every single one of them is going into private practice right out of graduation. And one of the reasons is it pays way more.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely.
So she said, Dad, I don't think I'm going to do it because everyone is telling me it pays way more. And even when she met with her advisors, they're like, there's a substantial difference in pay.
Yeah. I mean, and I don't think mental health providers, we're not the richest profession by any means, but, you can make a lot more money in private practice than you can at these institutional positions. But, it's funny because when I came out of grad school, those were the plum positions. Those were the positions that people fought to get was to work at the college counseling center. And they were very picky. So I, Lisa Ruff, would have had a very hard time getting hired by a college counseling center because I didn't do a practicum or internship in a college counseling center. So it's almost like they felt like college students were a different species of human, that none of the training I had with people of similar ages and many other settings would ever cross over. I couldn't get that kind of job. So, I mean, but it was sort of considered to be, very, it was a great job. You had reasonable hours. You didn't have to work at night. You maybe didn't make that much money, but you got to work on the college campus. It's a cool place to work. The kids, it is sort of seen as you're kind of just working with the boyfriend breakups and, the roommate fights and those kind of things. So the pathology wasn't seen as severe. But now it's completely changed and they can't fill those positions. Number one, they're not offering enough money. But number two, they don't offer their staff enough resources. I recently attended a continuing education on student mental health, and it was taught by a psychologist who had worked at Duke in the mental health program for years, and he quit. This was a man, he dedicated his training, his life to higher education, and he couldn't take it anymore because he had no support. He had no staff. The cases, when you're dealing with people with significant issues in pathology, it's kind of chaotic. It's a rocky treatment. It's not calm. he couldn't take it. And like, if this man couldn't take it, and he's like an expert, he's published books and papers, like, I don't know who can, and Duke is a very well-funded institution, as you have pointed out, although perhaps they're not spending the money in the way maybe we think they should. So it's turned into a very undesirable place to work. And it's very unfortunate.
Yeah. And it's not like you said, it's not like people are going into the profession to make money. But I mean, I've seen what some of the pay is for some of these college jobs. It's like $35,000 for like a master's degree.
Yeah, no, you could make more, like probably being the assistant manager at Chick-fil-A, honestly.
Yeah. Yeah. And so it's not like, well, these people are just all they care about is money. It's like, that's not enough to, even as a single person, and you may have loans and stuff. Like, that's just not enough to live.
Right. No, it's certainly, it's not. If you have any student loans, it's not.
Friends, this completes the first half. We hope you'll join us next week for the final part.
And now this week's interview with a special guest.
Friends, I'm really excited about this interview with Sue Corner. It's one of my favorite interviews I've ever done. And really, you're going to hear Sue over the next 4 weeks. And so for the first 2 weeks, she's going to talk about debunking myths about private schools. And she'll focus on 3 major myths. There are many more, but there's 3 that she really wants to address with some depth. And she'll do that over the next 2 weeks. And then the following 2 weeks, she'll do a real in-depth deep dive on a college that's very underrated that I think many more families need to be aware of, and it's Willamette University. But listen and enjoy part 1 of 2 of debunking myths about private colleges. Friends, you're in for a treat today. I'm here with Sue Corner, the Dean of Admission at Willamette University. Welcome to the Your College Bound Kid podcast, Sue.
Thank you so much for having me, Mark. I'm thrilled to be here.
Well, I mentioned this to you, but this is long overdue from my perspective because we've had at least 3 listeners that have written in and said, when are you going to talk about Willamette? So we can thank our listeners for forcing me to the table here, but I could not be happier.
I love that. I love that you're getting to the demand to hear about our little place here in Salem, Oregon. That's great.
Awesome. And before we get into our topic for the day, why don't you give our listeners some background? You can go anywhere you want with it, but certainly walk us through, various jobs you've had up to what you're doing now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I have a pretty straightforward career path here. My association with Willamette, I did the math not too long ago, and it goes back just over 35 years.
Love it.
In terms of when I came here as a student first in the late 80s. So I started my my college career here and fell in love with the idea of college admission while I was a student at Willamette. So when I graduated from Willamette, I went on to do a master's degree in higher ed administration at Oregon State University, just down the road. And then went into admission work and student activities work and did that work at Lewis and Clark College. And then came back to Willamette and have been at Willamette off and on ever since that time. And again, I've worked in multiple roles here, both on the student affairs side and in the admission realm, but primarily in admission.
That's good, though, that different perspective you have, because you have Lewis and Clark, so you know another school in the area that I'm sure you have a lot of overlap with. So you have that perspective. And then, of course, Oregon State. And then even having different roles within the university, I think sometimes gives you a broader perspective of things than someone that was just completely unidimensional.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, and it's fun now. I mean, these days, as I'm working very closely with prospective students and their families, to have had the student experience myself, even though it's a long time ago, but to have that alumni experience
Sure.
and, connect with the university from that standpoint, to be a long time and very devoted employee, and then I'm the parent of a current student at Willamette.
Oh, there's another lens.
Which is really fun. My daughter is happy to be here, regardless of the fact that her mom is, right on campus every day. But that's a fun lens to share with parents who are navigating this process too, just to be able to speak to what it feels like to be the parent of a bear cat is helpful. So, yeah.
Yeah, and it kind of makes a statement in and of itself. I did college admissions briefly in Texas, and then I had a 10-year stint where I was doing some different things, and then I returned to boarding school admissions in Pennsylvania, and I got the job because I had a child at the school, and so it's kind of like, okay, that's a powerful statement that we'll make, to perspectives, and so that was the thinking, and so it does make a statement that you're sort of voting with your own kid. That says something about the school because, you wouldn't send your kid somewhere unless you believed in it.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, and it's fun to be able to talk to parents about how complete Anna's search was. She didn't know she was coming to Willamette. She did a full college search, just like the child of any, I think, admission person would have their child do. She had lots of great options. And yes, the fact that she chose Willamette is, I hope, a testament to how much I believe in this place and what a good job our folks well beyond the admission office did in connecting with Willamette in her search. So it's really fun to have her here.
So Sue, you mentioned kind of return to admissions. Were you like the typical tour guide at Willamette? Did you have any connection with the admission office as a student at all in any way?
That's such a funny question. I did. I had decided somewhere along the way that I was really interested in this idea of working in the college administrative setting. And I didn't know in what capacity. I didn't really understand all of the options. So I went to the Career Center and said, how do I do an internship in somehow related to college administrative work? And they said, hey, go talk to Teresa Hudkins, who at that time was the longtime director of admission here at Willamette. She's the person who had recruited me from my high school. They said, go talk to Teresa and see if they have anything in admission. This was my junior year at Willamette. And Teresa, if anybody know, I'm sure lots of people know Teresa. She was amazing. She's just way too nice to have ever said no to a student coming and asking for something like that. And so I asked, and she said, sure, we'll figure out something for you to do. They did not have any sort of formal internship program at all. But they created one for me, which involved giving tours. It involved going to college fairs with some of the staff. It involved all kinds of things that came up that they realized, wow, this is handy to have a student intern in the office to do. And what's fun is that ever since we have had student interns. That was sort of the start of a program, not just for tour guides, but for this kind of bigger level internship experience for students in admission.
So you know what that means? That means you were a rock star. You paved the way and opened up the program.
I had no idea what I was doing. And really, it's all, thanks to Teresa. But it was a great experience for me. It was really fun. And it really gave me a lot of insight into what I, wanted to do with my life and career going forward. So I'm really grateful.
Let's take a break to learn about Mark's recommended resource for the week.
Friends, the recommended resource for episode 235 is an admissions blog. It's the University of Virginia's admissions blog. It is uvaapplication.blogspot.com. It's by Jeannine Lalonde, and she just does an outstanding job of being transparent about a lot of admission issues. Now, it is going to be fairly focused on applying to UVA, so I'm partly using this as an example so that you get familiar with admissions blogs, because you absolutely should be following them for any schools that you apply to. And I want to give you one example of why they're so powerful. Well, one of the things I'm doing with my students this summer is we're trying to work on the college-specific questions, but before August 1, when they're technically released by the Common App. And on June 13th, on UVA's admissions blog, they let you know they're doing an overhaul of their questions, and they shared what their questions were. So what that means is that if you're applying to the University of Virginia, you don't have to wait until August to know what your college-specific questions are. You can start working on them now because they're up. And that allows you to get as much done over the summer, particularly for students who are applying to 10 or more schools highly selective schools where they tend to have these college-specific questions, one of the most important things that you can do is to get them done over the summer. And one of the best ways to find them is to go to any admissions blog of the schools you're applying to and see if they've listed their college-specific questions. Many of them will list them between now and mid to late July. But this is also an outstanding blog for a lot of reasons. I want to recommend it to you. Once again, it's uvaapplication.blogspot.com. Now, Greg Roberts is actually the Dean of Admissions. We've had him on our podcast. Jeannine is actually an associate dean, but she handles the blog. We will now return to my interview with Sue Corner. Awesome. Well, our regular listeners know that anytime we have a thought leader on, I like them to talk about something they're passionate about. So in my pre-meeting with Sue, we bandied around a couple of topics, and as soon as she threw out the one we're going to talk about today, I was like, presto, that's it. Winner, winner, chicken dinner. I knew this would be what our listeners want. So we're going to talk about debunking myths about private schools. And I know there's quite a few we can get into, but why don't we just start with one, Sue, which is you can't be successful STEM major at a liberal arts college. You have to go to a national university. What do you want to say about that?
Thanks, Mark. This is such an interesting topic to me because it's so, I think it's so recent, really, in its in the way that it's developed. You know, the vernacular of the term STEM even has only been around for about, I don't know, 20 years maybe, and even that it's really become popularized probably in the last 10, where people are talking so consistently about STEM and what it means and why it's such an important part of the education of society today. And so as that vernacular has risen, there's been this interesting reaction of people who are searching for a college experience where they suddenly think, even more than they may have before, that an institution is either a place where you study STEM or it's a liberal arts institution. And the two are not the same. And that really this whole idea of STEM is only embraced in the larger research setting. And it's just such a missed opportunity for people who are really looking for a deep STEM experience at the undergraduate level. If you think about who is doing the research, who has access to equipment, who is actually publishing and writing and doing that deep, STEM experience at the bigger, really research-oriented places. Across the board, it is graduate students and their faculty. It is not happening at the undergraduate level. Doesn't mean that there isn't great instruction in the classroom, in a fairly large setting, but there isn't that ability to actually do research. Whereas at a place like Willamette, in the liberal arts setting, in the private small school setting, that hands-on piece in all disciplines is important and is accessible, but particularly in the sciences. We have some really interesting equipment here. For instance, at Willamette, we have an NMR spectrometer that's really, rare. And when students apply to graduate school after spending time at Willamette, and they list the number of hours they have on the spectrometer in their graduate school application, they'll often get pushback. These places will say, there's no way you actually spent time on this equipment.
Wow.
You can't have that. Our graduate students don't even have that,
So you're gonna have to tell me what that is, because that one just went over my pay grade.
I don't know. You'd have to talk to faculty to explain what it is. All I
don't know if it's physics or chemistry or astrophysics or neuroscience, what discipline uses it even?
I think it's a chemistry department that mostly uses it. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. But it's one of those things that, it's just such a clear example that students get to do the work that they really want to do in a way that is decidedly different if they're at a small school setting, because there are not graduate students ahead of them in line. All of our students are doing, research with faculty. They have funded research opportunities, both in the summer and during the school year, long-term study that they're doing, things that really set them up to have incredible opportunities at the graduate level where they get to then go on and do even more. But they're prepped for that in a way that is just really incredible. And they have actual access to the faculty. That's the other thing, is in the coursework that they're doing, not just the, experiential research, but in the day-to-day coursework, they're asking questions. Their faculty know them. They're in classes of, 12, 15 people. So they get to dig in and learn on a level that, I don't know, I think in the sciences, it really matters to be able to truly understand and ask questions. And how do you do that if you're in a room of 300, 400 people? So
What's your theory on the genesis, the origin of this myth? Like, what do you any thoughts on what you attribute it to, where it came from?
I mean, it sounds so simple, but
Mm-hmm.
honestly, I think some of it just comes from the misunderstanding of the term liberal arts.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The word art is in,
Mm-hmm. No, I
it is in
agree.
the name, and
I try to
people,
say liberal arts and sciences every chance I get, because I find just putting the word sciences in there changes people's perception. As
right.
soon as people hear art, they're oftentimes thinking of visual and performing arts, just art school, or maybe they're thinking exclusively about great things like social sciences and humanities, but they think it excludes sciences.
Exactly. They think even if maybe a liberal arts college has a biology major, but it can't possibly be at the same caliber or level as a place that really focuses on the sciences. Liberal arts at its very core, I mean, from its birthplace was I'll see if I can get the terms right. It was the trivium, right, that included grammar, logic, and rhetoric,
Mm-hmm.
and the quadrivium, which included arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. So if you think about those topics that were the kind of the origin of this idea of the liberal arts way back in the day, it was equally quantitative and other, but just by virtue of the fact that the name is confusing, I think that's set us on a trajectory that tends to confuse people. And so,
Yeah, I interviewed Matt McGinn, Dean of Admission at Amherst. He talked about this a fair amount, and he was like, terrible marketing on our part,
yeah, yeah,
you know,
no,
like it
it's
couldn't
true.
be worse. Now, how do you experience this as someone who works at a liberal arts and science school? Like, do you I could ask, how do you even know this is true? Like, do you experience it because you see refusal surveys and some people say, oh, I wanted to go to a STEM place, or maybe your people are out talking and they're at fairs and they say, oh, I can't talk to you. I'm interested in STEM. I'm at the wrong table. Like, what are some of the ways in which you sort of know this to be true?
Yeah, it's sort of all of the above. I mean, we certainly have people who, during just those face-to-face interactions that we get to have, whether it's at a college fair or it's at a high school or it's at a, information night at a school-specific event, where we will have people just express their surprise. Oh, you prepare students for med school? Really?
Right.
You actually have people go to med school? And we're like, yes, I think we're Oregon Health Science University's favorite, form of preparation. Don't quote me on that, but
Sure.
they love our students. We will get that surprise from people. We'll have people even say, I didn't even know that you could study chemistry at a place like this. And so it's, you just experience in the day-to-day, the
Sure.
learning curve for people. We've also done some of that, behind the scenes research on how people are searching for what they think they want. And it often is, I only want a Bachelor of Science degree in biology, chemistry, physics, whatever it might be. Because obviously that's the only way to prepare for what I want to do. There's this misunderstanding that even a Bachelor of Arts in biology, chemistry, physics, whatever, is equally strong preparation for whatever that next step is that they want to want to go on to do. So, and that's actually something that we've responded to by Willamette for many, many years only offered the Bachelor of Arts degree. And we've adjusted that in recent years in response in great part to this kind of STEM misunderstanding. We've built back in a Bachelor of Science degree so that people don't miss us entirely as they're searching for the right experience for them.
This is really well articulated. I appreciate that, Sue. Let's look at the next one. Private colleges are less accessible than public colleges, particularly financially. What do you want to say about this particular myth?
Well, this one is, I mean, this is a really understandable myth, right?
Sure.
Look at the sticker price, as we like to call it, and people say, of course I can't go to a private college. The tuition alone is $60,000, whereas I look at some of the public colleges in my region and it's half or less than that. So the sticker price tells me the whole story. And again, I think this would be probably an example of bad marketing on our part, or it's very hard for us to help people understand the sticker price is one thing, but the degree to which many liberal arts colleges, and certainly Willamette, the degree to which we get to reward students who are well prepared for their education with a merit scholarship changes that picture of the sticker price dramatically. So no one at Willamette is paying the sticker price. Everyone who is deemed admissible has done meritorious work in high school, and they are rewarded for that with some level of merit scholarship. So in many, many cases, and we've studied this several times over the course of the last several years, if you compare a student who is well prepared for Willamette, who applies to us and applies to our most common overlap public peer, whose price tag is less than half of ours, it will cost them less to come to Willamette and complete their degree. That's a piece of the puzzle.
Right, because it's more oftentimes 4 years than 5 or 6 also, too.
Exactly.
You factor that in.
Yeah, you have to factor in both that additional time spent in school to complete what should be a 4-year degree and lost time out in the world actually earning. So when you start to add all of those things in, it is really, truly, in many cases, more affordable for a student to come to a private college. They have to look past the sticker price and go through the application and aid process in order to understand what we're actually going to cost. And then they have to think about what that cost is actually affording them in terms of, the value of the experience and the outcomes that they're going to achieve because of the degree that they hold going forth in life. In many cases, this idea that it's just too expensive and it's not worth it is just such a mistake. And so we're trying to get that word out there. And I think more and more and more counselors, private counselors in the high schools see and understand this concept because they see how it's been playing out for students for the last, couple of decades in a very real way. But it's still something that we need to help parents and family members understand better.
Yeah. And just before we came on live today, Sue and I were talking about how I've found that the students I work with have been very pleased with, your financial offers that you have made. Friends, this concludes the first part of our interview. I hope you'll join us next week for the second part.
And now it's time for our College Spotlight of the Week.
Friends, you are treated to a double interview this week. A double interview. You've already heard from Sue Corner, who served as our technical interview, but we also have a College Spotlight interview, and it's with Steve Robinson. And right from the time I met Steve, we connected immediately. You would think we've known each other for 10 or 20 years. I want to really shout out Joel Depker, who introduced me to Steve. What a fantastic interview. He's our second president that we've interviewed on Your College Bound Kid. And I'm going to continue to interview more presidents. They just have a great macro view. And what Steve does in this interview is several things. He dispels a lot of the myths about community colleges He's such a passionate advocate for community colleges. He just explains just the unique role they have in American higher ed and how there's such a missed opportunity for people not to know their own local community college and take advantage of the fantastic teaching and the small classes that they offer. And then he also talks about Lansing Community College, where he is the president. It's a two-parter. I think you'll really enjoy it. Listen and enjoy. Friends, I'm here with Dr. Steve Robinson, the president of Lansing Community College. Welcome to the Your College Bound Kid podcast, Steve.
Oh, thanks a lot, Mark. It's wonderful to be here.
Well, I knew we were going to have a good interview, and after our pre-meeting, you ended it by saying, go green.
Go white.
Go green, go white. So for those of you not getting, this is like internal talk that us Spartan alums use amongst ourselves. So
that's right.
So with that, why don't you tell us about your backstory, where you grew up, various jobs you've had in education, and what you're doing today?
Sure, Mark. Well, I'll start with that thing we have in common. All three of my degrees are from Michigan State University, so I'm a proud
Sweet.
Spartan. Actually, one of my kids is a sophomore there, and he's fourth generation MSU student. So we've got a strong connection to East Lansing and Michigan State University. I grew up in Metro Detroit. So my dad lived in downtown Detroit and my mom lived in the suburbs. And I came to Michigan State as an 18-year-old, and I was a theater major. I didn't know what I was going to do. I ended up getting a degree in English. And I used that degree to play in a band and work in a guitar store for a while. And then I went to get a master's degree. And this is where things get interesting for me in higher ed. I tagged along with a buddy who was teaching at the local community college, this one, Lansing Community College. That visit changed my life. I'd been in classrooms my whole life, but this heterogeneous, exciting experience of having students that were older than my parents from all walks of life, that day I decided I need to work at a community college. So I went back to Morrill Hall, which no longer exists, Mark. It's not there. It's a parking lot now. But and I changed my major, and I got a master's degree in English community college teaching, went on, got a doctorate in rhetoric and composition, and I've been a community college person ever since. Was a faculty member for 15 years, and then had a pretty standard academic affairs career, coordinator, dean, vice president, provost, and this is my second community college presidency at one of the best community colleges in the country, Lansing Community College.
Yeah, I mean, even growing up as a student at Michigan State, I would always hear Lansing Community College. It really had a presence in the area, and that was in the 80s.
Yeah, well, well, thanks for noticing and remembering that. We really do have a great reputation in town. We were founded in 1957 before there was even a Community College Act in Michigan. The community college idea was fairly new in 1957. Of course, there were junior colleges, but the Truman Commission that gave birth to the American Comprehensive Community College didn't convene until 1947. So we've got a long history for a community college.
Yeah, and I'd be remiss if I didn't give a shout out to Joel Depker. Joel connected us. Joel's a community college leader in Missouri.
Right.
And he also was a Spartan fan as well because he has Michigan roots before that. And so he did his homework and he said, this is just somebody you need to talk to. And so I've been wanting for someone to talk about the community college space. 27% of students are at community college. That's a large number. And I feel like it's really misunderstood. So why don't you take some time and tell us why you think community colleges present a great opportunity for so many students?
It's my favorite subject, Mark. And I'll actually, your 27% is correct depending on how you calculate things. But if you look at the number of students who have some kind of community college credits, it's much higher than 27%.
What would the number be? Do you know?
Well, it's been a while. We'd have to go to somewhere like the Community College Research Center.
Sure,
I'm thinking it's well north of 40%.
Wow.
Yeah, of students who graduate with a 4-year degree with some kind of community college experience. And that will go up significantly given the amount of dual enrollment we see happening at community colleges. But in answer to your question, in my estimation, the American Comprehensive Community College is one of the coolest American ideas that there is. We've built out this infrastructure across our country. There are about 1,100 community colleges. Nearly every American is within commuting distance of a community college. And community colleges have two broad missions. One is social mobility of students, and the other is economic development of the communities in which they serve. So most community colleges have a dual purpose of occupational training in areas like healthcare and technical education, but also great transfer programming. And we're great at both of those here at LCC. So most Americans have this asset in their community that in my mind is something uniquely American and something that we're really, really proud of.
Yeah, but nevertheless, there's a stigma there. There's a stigma with community colleges that, in fact, I listened to a podcast you were on,
Right.
addressing the stigma. It's not necessarily something that wows and excites everyone. And in fact, one of the things that came up in the podcast that you were on, I can't remember who you were just talking with, but they said in the state of New Jersey, schools are evaluated based on the number of kids they send to four-year colleges.
Right.
And the higher, the better. And I'm here to say that's more of the norm than the exception. That's one of the triggers for certain colleges that this is a college prep environment, is that they're sending kids to four-year colleges. So help untangle, why is there such a stigma for something that's so great?
Well, Mark, it's a great question, one that's really near and dear to my heart. I mean, I'll probably be talking on a couple tracks about this. One is, you're correct. There are some inaccurate or I think unfair perceptions of community and technical colleges across our country. And I have used that word stigma. We've launched a social media campaign, #EndCommunityCollegeStigma. The podcast you're talking about was a project we did to talk to faculty and staff and alumni and business leaders about the perception issues of two-year colleges across the country. There are a number of reasons for it, but I think one of them is most of the perceptions in this sector of higher ed are not based on data or direct experience, but what I would call lore. And I know this is what you do for a living. You talk to people about college choices and where their young people are headed. But a lot of that information doesn't come from professionals like you. It comes from, something that a friend or a neighbor said or a parent, and it's all passed down by word of mouth and lore. And so a lot of folks who have strong negative perceptions about community colleges, where make us the butt of jokes and things like that, have never set foot on a community college campus, haven't had the direct experience with our institutions. And what I'll tell you, and I hope we get a chance to talk about more about it in this in our conversation, but in comparison to, say, liberal arts colleges or state universities, what you find at a community college, by and large, in addition to lower tuition, is smaller class size and amazing faculty. I was a faculty member at a community college, a really good one, for 15 years. And the amount of time and attention I could give to my students in freshman comp is far more than what you might see at other colleges, because you're familiar with this three-part mission of faculty of teaching, research, and service. Now, there's research and there is service at community colleges, but we're primarily teaching institutions. So the best college faculty I've ever met have been community college educators. And oftentimes those folks are teaching the exact same class at the local university and at the community college, but with smaller class size. So that's one aspect of it. But to your question, I think it's where does the perception come from? Probably lore. And the other thing is, if you compare the tradition of higher education, which goes back hundreds of years, right? Mm-hmm. Community colleges are relatively new. I mean, we were founded in 1957. The oldest two-year colleges go to the early part of the 20th century. So that might be it as well.
Another thing I think that might play a role is you'll see data sometimes that will show low graduation rates.
Yes.
And can you comment on how that data is, misinterpreted and skewed and is not necessarily presenting an accurate truism?
I can. And, I want to do it in a way where it doesn't sound like an excuse, because there are amazing community colleges moving the needle in incredible ways on persistence, completion, and graduation. But I will outline two things for you, Mark. One is the community colleges in our country were founded on an access agenda. So we are higher education's open door, right? I know you spent a lot of time talking to your listeners about highly selective institutions, how to get in, where you want to get in. But the design of the comprehensive community college is we're here for everybody. Everybody can come. We are not highly selective institutions. Now, there are some exceptions to that at the program level, because some of our programs have such a high waiting list or are competitive admit. You see this primarily in healthcare, but we were founded on an access agenda, and that's one reason, is that we're comparing against everybody who might show up, including folks who were severely challenged in high school or maybe not have even graduated from high school. That's thing number one. Thing number two is the average community college student in the United States is 26, 27 years old, is a working professional, many of them parents. And so the IPEDS rate, or the way that we take a look at, GRS 150, or, our students are primarily part-time and take longer to achieve degrees. So those are two reasons, but they shouldn't be used as excuses, because there are amazing community college success stories across this country of institutions dramatically raising their graduation rates.
No, those are all great points. And one thing John Bockenstadt likes to always say, I don't know if you know John Bockenstadt, but he was VP of enrollment at DePaul. Now he's at Oregon State.
Okay.
Is that graduation rates are more input data. It's more of a reflection of the composition of your student body. And of course, there's a lot of correlation between family wealth and graduation rates.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that point is well taken. The other thing that we talk about in community colleges, and I suppose throughout higher ed we could talk about this as well, is that many times our students come and they get enough skills before they earn a credential to really transform their lives, get an amazing job, do something they came here to learn how to do, and that it doesn't snap to a credential. But they are success. So if we're engineering for success, and that is, by the way, the best community colleges in the country are focused on what we call post-college success. Do students not are they just contributing to our graduation rates or persistent rates or average GPAs, but did our students succeed in ways after college for the reason that brought them here?
It's funny. There's a lot of things that you have mentioned that any parent would consider to be important.
Correct.
When it comes to quality education. One is the primacy of teaching and the value of teaching.
Right.
Another is small classes. And I think that point about teaching is really important. You're not necessarily focusing on research or football or some of the other things that may draw kids to schools, right?
Right.
It's pure teaching. I'm really glad you brought that up. But I think there's another thing that you brought up earlier, and it's probably one of the things that stimulated you, was to be in a classroom with such a range of different types of learners. There are a lot of parents that would espouse the value of diversity,
right,
in an educational setting, and it seems to me that community colleges, showcase that diversity in some very effective ways. I want to comment on that at all?
I do, and I couldn't agree more, Mark. So if you take, and again, I am a huge fan of just about every sector of higher ed. I like all three of my degrees are from a R1 university, our very proud alma mater, right?
Sure.
It's a great place, but when you take a look at the courses that we teach here at LCC and those same sections over at MSU, there's a greater diversity of students in that smaller class. So it's not just smaller. I mean, we don't have big amphitheater classes like
Sure.
you do at an R1. But you do have students with a more diverse set of experiences, and in my 15 years in the classroom, that's what made a class special. I loved all my classes, but the ones that really stood out, there was a wide variety of students in the class, bringing to that class a variety of rich experiences where students learn from one another. You could also take a look at that, not just in the classroom, but co-curricular experiences. I'll give you another example from my time at MSU. I am passionate about radio, and I aspired to have a show on WDBM, The Impact, our MSU radio station. It took me 3 years. It's very competitive to get on the FM radio station, and I eventually did it, had a great show and a great time. students who want to do radio at LCC could do it yet this semester.
Wow.
We're actually, there's a call, we got a call for students to get involved in our LCC Connect audio programming to develop a show, put it on not just streaming, but FM. And that you could say that about just about any co-curricular experience at a community college. Opportunities for leadership that would present themselves sooner for students to be the president of a club when they graduate. So there are a lot of opportunities in addition to what I'm talking about with teaching and learning.
And one benefit is we can't get around it. So let's just throw it out there. Cost. I mean, that's a huge benefit, especially as we know that the cost of college has been rising faster than healthcare, and it's a constant, cause of concern. $1.6 trillion of student debt now, more than credit cards and auto loans, and so I think a lot of people, because they may not necessarily even look at community colleges, may not have a sense of what the cost structure is. You want to kind of give our listeners a lay of the land of what the costs are, and I know it can vary from state to state, but feel free to comment on that as well.
Absolutely. So, and you know what, sometimes we debate this among community college professionals, but I'm one of these folks who say, let's talk about cost and value. Now, the community colleges across this country are funded in radically different ways. I mean, there's some states that have statewide systems. There's some like Michigan where we have 28 completely independent community colleges. Some of them have local property tax funding, which is similar to what you see in K-12. Some of them are funded like state university systems, but by and large, community college tuition is probably a third or less than what you would see from flagship state universities, or even, just your normal research universities in any given state. And particularly for students who are Pell eligible, the Pell grant for most students more than covers all of tuition. And when you lay that alongside the fact that many of these excellent faculty at community colleges are also teaching at the universities in the general area, their cost does play a role there, particularly if you're talking about conserving resources for later degrees. So if you are able to make your tuition dollars go farther in the first 2 years as you're working toward a baccalaureate transfer program, that opens a student's horizon for what happens at junior, senior year, or maybe leaves resources on the table for graduate or professional programs. And, I think we should start thinking about how we finance education earlier. I know you have with your listeners, that's an important component of it.
Are you sensing a greater priority on the part of four-year schools to partner with community colleges? Because I'm hearing more and more talk of reaching out to non-traditional students, both through community colleges and transfer students and older students, and not relying so much on the traditional 18-year-old with, all the stuff that you hear with the demographic challenges that's coming, tidal wave that's coming, to higher ed in 2025, 2026. Are you hearing anything like that? Do you sense there's momentum?
I absolutely am, and I think it is completely different conversation between baccalaureate transfer destination institutions and community colleges than it was even 10 years ago. All the enrollment management folks across four-year colleges have read Graw's work on demographics, sure. Right? You talk about the demographic cliff, it's coming. But if your institutional values include reaching out to underrepresented students and diversifying your student body, partnerships with community colleges are huge for those kind of strategic initiatives. Now, the other thing I'd say, just from a personal standpoint, at two different really excellent community colleges, I've found the universities in the local area to be great partners on transfer in a way that they weren't a while ago, because before maybe the university perceived that they were competing for the community college's best students. Now, back in Ohio, I was really proud to launch some transfer programs with a number of excellent four-year partners. and found it pretty easy to get them started because we had willing partners at Bowling Green State University, University of Toledo, Lord's University, and University of Findlay. We built these express programs that still exist between Owens Community College and those schools. And these are dual admission programs that are designed to eliminate barriers to completion of the associate's degree and transfer with momentum to the four-year partner. We're doing the same thing here at Lansing Community College. Shortly after I arrived, we were able to launch Envision Green, which is a similar program between Lansing Community College and Michigan State. And what's interesting to me, Mark, is that community college students and their families have been doing this for decades. We're formalizing it. My father-in-law, my wife's dad, was one of our very first Lansing Community College students in 1958. Nobody in his family went to college. And there was this brand new thing in his community called the community college. And the next thing he knows, he transfers to Michigan State, gets a degree in packaging, and transforms the lives of an entire wing of his family because he's the first person in his family to go to college. So what we're doing with some of these transfer programs, much more than, let's say, a traditional 2+2, is to eliminate barriers to successful transfer.
Friends, this completes the first half of our College Spotlight. We hope you'll join us next week for the final part.
Next Monday in the news, we are going to have the admission announcements interview with Bryn Burton on, quote, my journey from Wyoming to the East Coast for college. That'll be part one of a one-part discussion. See you then.
And friends, it's not where you go, but it's what you do when you get there, and it's what you do when you get out of there. Because college admissions is not a prize to be won. It is a match to be made. See you next week, friends.
Take care.
And that's our show. A big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in this week. If you find this podcast helpful, please follow us, and you'll get every single episode as soon as it is released. If you're interested, there are a few ways you can really support our podcast. You can click the share button and send it to your friends and acquaintances. You can help us pay our staff and our expenses by donating on our website. You can write a review for us on Apple or Spotify. I'm the producer of the podcast, but we have a fantastic team of 14. Shout out to our co-host, Dr. Lisa Ruff, Dr. David Williams, Susan Tree, Vince Garcia, and Julia Esquivel, and to our substitute co-host, Sylvia Borgo. Our sensational sound engineer is Nemanja Motvich. Our amazing music is from Victor Allen Weeks. Marketing designs are from Kimberly Blass. Lily Parikh manages our Instagram. Our image editor is Talha Khan. Joyce Ducker does our website episode updates. And our webmaster is Stalianos Dimitriou. If you want to have a coaching session with Lisa or me, just text me at 404-664-4340. If you have a question you want us to answer, or if you have a recommended resource or article you think we should discuss, just send it to questions@yourcollegeboundkid.com. By the way, check out our website, where you'll find lots of content that is not on any podcast app. Our website is yourcollegeboundkid.com. If you want to learn about other hot admissions topics, follow us on Twitter at YCBK Podcast. We think of you as our listening family, and we look forward to meeting again with you every single Thursday.